All right, let's talk about Reach. This is the game that came out of the gate with some massive promises, right? It was supposed to be VR's next epic, a true AAA adventure built from the ground up for our headsets. The hype was real, but the big question is, did it actually stick the landing?
So, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is this the blockbuster we've all been waiting for in VR? I mean, the ambition was there, the budget was clearly there, but the game itself, well, it's not a simple yes or no. It's complicated.
So, where did this game even come from? Well, Reach is from a studio called nDreams Elevation. And get this, they were basically created specifically to make these huge cinematic VR games. So yeah, from the second this thing was announced, expectations were just through the roof. We weren't just looking at a new game. We were hoping for a new classic for the whole platform.
So let's get the basics out of the way. We're looking at a cinematic action-adventure game, and you can play it on pretty much everything: PS VR2, Quest 3, and PC VR. And the big promise was this awesome mix of intense physical climbing, some slick combat, and brain-teasing puzzles, all wrapped up in this big-budget blockbuster package. Of course, an adventure like this needs a world that just pulls you in, and the story of Reach takes us way, way down deep into this lost civilization, a world of myth and machines buried miles beneath our feet. So you step into the shoes of Rosa, an explorer who, let's just say, has a really bad day and takes a tumble into this underground world called Ferra. And her guide? A massive living statue named Atlas. The whole setup is just fantastic. It has that perfect grand sci-fi fantasy vibe right from the start. But here's where things get a little tricky. The game starts with this absolutely spectacular, high-energy intro that gets you hooked immediately. The problem is, according to a lot of reviews, that momentum just doesn't last. The story's pacing starts to get a little weird and inconsistent. And honestly, the main characters, Rosa and Atlas, they just don't really develop the kind of charisma that makes you truly care about what happens to them. Okay, but let's talk about what really matters in VR, right? How does the game feel? That sense of presence, of actually being there, that's what can make or break a game. So how does Reach stack up when it comes to movement and immersion? Man, those first few moments are just pure, uncut adrenaline. It honestly feels like they dropped you into an Uncharted game built for VR. You've got helicopters shooting at you, you're doing all this crazy parkour across crumbling ruins. It's an incredible, heart-pounding start that sets the action bar ridiculously high. And for a lot of people, this feeling, this sense of physicality, is where Reach is an absolute home run. I mean, critics have called it an exemplary VR adventure for this very reason. The climbing, the jumping, just the feeling that your body is in that world, it's just so, so well done. But, and this is a big but, after that incredible, breathtaking opening, the whole rhythm of the game just changes. Those high-speed action scenes become pretty rare. Instead, the game settles into this core loop that is super heavy on puzzle rooms. And for a lot of players, that's where the initial thrill starts to wear off and feel, well, a little repetitive. So let's really dig into that gameplay loop, the combat, the puzzles, the pacing. How does it all actually work over the full 5 to 8 hour adventure? Okay, so what are you working with? Your main weapon is a bow, pretty standard, but you also get cool elemental arrows. Fire, ice, you know the drill. You've also got this throwable shield, which is pretty neat for both blocking attacks and solving puzzles. The catch? The enemies you're fighting are, well, they're mostly pretty basic machines that don't put up much of a fight. So you end up with this really clear trade-off with the combat. On one hand, it's super satisfying physically, you know? Drawing back a bow, throwing a shield in VR, it just feels awesome. But on the other hand, the enemies are so simple that there's really no strategy to it. It's fun for a minute, but it never really makes you think. All in all, you're looking at about 5 to 8 hours to finish the story, which, hey, that's a decent length for a VR game. The only bummer is there's no New Game Plus, not even a chapter select. So once you've seen the credits, there's not much reason to jump back in. All right, now we need to talk about something really important, maybe the most important part of this whole review: performance. Because let me tell you, your experience with Reach is going to be wildly different depending on what headset you're playing on. Let's start with the king of the castle here, the Quest 3. Seriously, this version is a straight-up technical marvel. They're using this clever tech called asynchronous space warp to push a super smooth 72 frames per second, and it looks insanely good for a standalone headset.
People are comparing it to a PS4 game, and honestly, they're not wrong. It is without a doubt the definitive way to play this game. So, what about the big boys, the more powerful platforms? Well, this is where it gets weird. Both the PSVR2 and the PCVR versions are kind of a letdown. You get these distracting visual artifacts. Textures are all over the place in terms of quality, and this one just blows my mind. They barely use the cool hardware features, like the PSVR2's haptics or adaptive triggers. The amazing art style is still there, for sure, but the technical polish just isn't. Okay, we've gone through the story, the gameplay, and the huge performance gap between headsets, so now it's time to put it all together and answer that big question. Is Reach actually worth your time and your money? And if you look at the critics, you'll see that opinion is all over the map. You have Upload VR, who absolutely loved it, praising the immersion and the physicality. Then you've got someone like Raymanta44, who called it good, thought the Quest version was magical, but docked points for the simple combat. And then other outlets were way more mixed, really hitting on those repetitive puzzles and the weak story as deal breakers.
So when you really boil it down, the game's strengths are undeniable. First off, the ambition and scale, huge for VR. That feeling of physical immersion, absolutely world-class. The cinematic moments are often stunning. And man, on the Quest 3, it's a new benchmark for what that little headset can do.
But you gotta look at the other side of that coin, and the weaknesses are just as clear. The gameplay loop gets bogged down in repetition, the combat is shallow, there's no getting around it, the story and characters just don't hit the mark. And for a ton of people, that lackluster performance on PSVR2 and PC is a massive disappointment. And that brings us to a really simple, direct recommendation. If you have a Quest 3 and you've been starving for a big AAA-style adventure, stop what you're doing and go buy Reach. It is a showcase for your headset. For everybody else on PSVR2 and PCVR, it's still an important, ambitious game, but you have to go in knowing you're getting a flawed, compromised experience. So what's the legacy of this game? Is Reach a flawed milestone for VR? I think it is. It absolutely pushes things forward in what we should expect from VR in terms of scale and immersion. But it stumbles. The pacing, the story, the tech issues, they keep it from being that perfect masterpiece it was so clearly trying to be. It's an incredible peek at the future of VR gaming, even if it's not quite there itself.